Also, some foreign carriers have already managed to obtain a license over the years without getting one of these agreements. Those people are not off the hook, because at some point if they need approval of one kind or another, they'll go back to the FCC and then they could be asked to sign an agreement. Or some people already have an agreement. And they say, okay, I've got my agreement, I don't have to worry about this. They file a new application and Team Telecom comes and says, well, we kind of want to change the one you've got. And so they end up getting a second agreement. I've got several clients who have more than one of these agreements in place. Also, there are a number of entities who believe they are offering unregulated services in the U.S. As a result, they don't have a license for that. VoIP is probably the best example. Hospitality services might be another. At some point, it might be clarified that those people need licenses. Again, if you're an overseas entity particularly, that could result in a request that you sign a national security agreement. Now, why do you need to know about this if you're any of these entities? For a couple of reasons. One, if you're thinking of making an acquisition, this could modify your business case. Some of these, yes?
You mentioned hosted services. That's also...
I mentioned hospitality services, yeah.
Do you need a license for this in the US?
I'm sorry?
Do you need a license for hosted services in the US?
Hospitality?
Hospitality?
No.
Or
He's saying that they may, at some point, change the rules.
it depends what you do with your hospitality services. If you're, for example, if voice gets put into that mix at any point, then you have to think about whether I'm a regulated entity. VoIP, for example, it's been unclear for years whether it's a regulated service. Some VoIP providers have said, what the heck, I'm going to go and get licensed because I see that coming. So they get licensed. Other people say, no, I'm going to wait until the very last minute and I'm going to be dragged kicking and screaming into the regulated era. But at some point that could happen. And the FCC could finally, after all this time, clarify that you need a license. But there are a number of people who are doing things that are close to the line, and they say we're a non-common carrier, we're an information services provider, whatever it is, they have a rationale for why they don't have a license. That can change at any time. And then when they need to get this license, that's when they could face one of these requests for an agreement. But if you're buying an entity, recognize that some of these restrictions, for example, where you locate infrastructure, your ability to outsource, all of that is affected by these agreements. So the actual business case you put in place for buying an entity could be affected. It could affect how you structure your U.S. operations. Drafting, I'm a lawyer, drafting the contracts, you need to take this into account. All the approvals you need to take, all the agreements you need to negotiate, all of that plays into the transaction itself, and of course the timing of the transaction. Team Telecom doesn't move that fast, I got to tell you, they just don't. They can if they really, really have to, especially if a CFIUS filing is involved, then they tend to move fast. But if it's just an FCC application, like I said, AT&T is still negotiating on AAG. It's been almost a year. So you need to take that into account in terms of the timing of your transaction. And all of these, I have to say, all of these agreements are negotiated documents. It isn't where somebody presents you with something and says, sign on the dotted line. It is negotiation. And so you need to be prepared for that. And that's all I have.
Question?
I'm just playing devil's advocate, but if it's a foreign carrier to foreign carrier, how does the FCC regulate?
Because if the acquired entity has a U.S. affiliate with a license, the ultimate owner of that entity is changing due to the transaction overseas. That requires FCC approval. I mean, I'll give you an example that happened to me 2 years ago. One of my clients is Telstra, the Australian telco. They were privatized by the government at the end of 2006. That required FCC approval. It was a change in ownership of Telstra, which has a U.S. affiliate in New York. Imagine my joy in telling the Australian government, you have to go to the FCC and get approval. And they also had to go to the state of New York and the state of California to get approval for this massive privatization. So if you're doing a deal and you're in Asia, and one Asian carrier buys another Asian carrier, if the acquired entity has a licensed U.S. affiliate, they've got to get FCC approval. They also should file with CFIUS because it's the acquisition of a U.S. business. That is, that U.S. affiliate is a U.S. business.
But what sanctions can be taken against them if they don't go through this process?
It usually doesn't come to that, because when they don't do it, it's because they had no idea they had to. I mean, it's not like they're deliberately not obeying it. You talk to them sometimes, you say, what? I had to do what? They just had no idea they had that obligation. In theory, the FCC could reject the application and make them, I guess, undo the deal, or at least cut loose the U.S. affiliate. they can impose fines and forfeitures. Typically, it gets worked out because usually there's no intent on the part of the entity doing this to to do something that they're not supposed to do. But it takes time and it screws up your transaction, is my point.
So would this say that, say if I have something like Philippine long distance in my building, and they want to do direct interconnections with Japan Telecom in my building, the FCC has an interest in that physical connection between Philippine long distance and Japan Telecom that's on U.S. soil?
The FCC probably doesn't. They would not regulate that. The connections that happen in...
As long as it doesn't cross a state line.
Yeah.
If it's interstate, it's FCC. If
So
it's
it's purely international to California, international to California, and then cross-connect within California, the FCC wouldn't care about that.
It has jurisdiction over it, but doesn't care. I mean, it's not going to regulate that.
yeah, from a regulatory standpoint. But that's the interesting thing about what Bob's talking about to me.
Well, this Team Telecom doesn't seem like it has anything to do with regulatory anything. It seems like it has to do with some, like you said, a shadow organization, some twisted version of the Patriot Act or something like that that says that they can enter buildings and do what they want to between foreign governments, kind of like going through the gate of an embassy.
Well, as I was saying, they actually need something to hold hostage. I mean, that's the best analogy. With your co-location thing, there's nothing there they can hold hostage and say, you have to sign an agreement with me. They wait for someone to file a CFIUS notification or an FCC application, then they say, we're not going to let that be granted unless you come and work with us to put an agreement in place that we're happy with. But in that example of, Japan Telecom interconnecting with PLDT's U.S. affiliate, there's nothing there that requires them to file anything with the FCC. They just do that. So there's nothing in that transaction that requires FCC approval, and so there's no basis for Team Telecom to come in on that and say, you have to do this.
Well, how about, let me add another flavor to that. If Tiscali lands in New York and then comes to California through the United States and connects to Philippine long distance,
They still wouldn't need to ask permission, but the FCC could regulate it.
Yeah, I mean, they would need a license to go across the U.S., though.
No.
If it's
They
a
buy a
physical pipe, if it's
Yeah.
just they're buying a circuit off someone else, then no.
If they're not providing a U.S. service, then they don't have to. But if they're providing a U.S. service, then the FCC licenses that.
They're buying a U.S. service from another provider to connect in a different city, to go through this country, basically, to get between other points of the world.
I don't know this is true. I'm not speaking for Tiscali or Philippine long distance or anybody else, but Tiscali doesn't trench from New York to L.A. Tiscali buys somebody else's.
Correct.
Getting to the finer point of what is infrastructure as opposed to rent infrastructure in that sense, and then I'm kind of curious about what you said you can't share, which is the particulars of this agreement that they're willing to buy into. Like basically they can do a passive tap, or they can pull the plug at their whim, or it's kind of a...
There's typically nothing in there that says they can pull the plug on it. There usually are provisions that say you have to, if you're the carrier, you agree to cooperate with lawful U.S. process in electronic surveillance. So it has to be lawful. They can't just go in and say, hey, open up, we're here to tap this line. They have to have a warrant.
Laws have been changing pretty quickly.
Correct.
In terms of don't
Yeah.
need a warrant anymore.
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
True. See, I'm curious as it relates to this. I mean, it's nice and all that people have to ask permission to do stuff, and that, U.S. government in certain situations can keep tabs and hold certain things hostage as it relates to pieces of paper and know who's doing what, where, but I don't see how any of that helps us protect the physical air infrastructure. It might help us tap and listen and lawful intercept and stuff like that, but there's no direction from the government as it relates to what I'm hearing. Maybe I'm not understanding.
Well, the one thing they are doing that's moving that direction is probably not going to be enough from your perspective.